And with that, we are going to get started right on the stroke of 12 o'clock. Um, Here in Saskatchewan, 11 a.m. Alberta time, and then wherever you're meeting us across Canada and across the world. Welcome, welcome. My name is Dr. Merle Massey. I'm the Executive Director of the Do More Agriculture Foundation, and I welcome all of you here to this particular chat today. The Farm Transition Panel, of course, we are celebrating farm transitions. They are tough, and this is what we're going to be talking about today, prioritizing mental health and good health as part of the farm transition, and taking care of the people as part of the farm transition. I'd like to open today just as a reminder that we are today's stewards, those of us who actively farm, such as myself. We are today's stewards of the land across Canada, agricultural land, but we have inherited this land from the ancestors, all of the ancestors, including, of course, and prioritizing and recognizing and celebrating our First Nations ancestors who conducted enormous and amazing agriculture in so many different ways across Canada, including here in Western Canada, which is where I am. My husband and I farm in West Central Saskatchewan. And in 1762, one of the Hudson Bay's company explorers came through right to where we now farm, and recognized that there were tobacco fields right where we farm today. So if you think that we're the first ones to farm in Western Canada, no, we're not. And there are amazing stories. So please reach out and find some of those stories, and we honor those stories together. I'm going to turn it over to Amber Campbell, who is the team leader of lending for AFSC, I'm sorry, and, and to bring you welcome from AFSC. Amber.
Thank you, Merle, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today to celebrate Farm Transition Appreciation Day. Let me tell you, it's an absolute honor to be here today to support Alberta's farming families as they navigate one of the most important and personal aspects of their farming journeys, and that is transitioning to the next generation. At Agriculture Financial Services, we understand that farm transitions are more than just logistics. They're about ensuring that the family legacy continues to thrive. And today's Farm Transition Appreciation Day theme, Legacy in Motion, really reminds us of the crucial role that farmers play in shaping a sustainable and successful future for agriculture. That's why we are proud to partner with the Do More Agriculture Foundation to present today's virtual fireside chat. And we're here to highlight the emotional well-being that is so often overlooked during farm transitions. Managing the complexities of transitioning a family farm is emotionally demanding, and it's critical that we prioritize mental health and resilience in the process. Today's session will feature a distinguished panel of experts who will share their insights and tools to support farm families through these transitions. So we've already met our facilitator, Dr. Merle Massey, and the panel also includes Lydia Carpenter, a farm family coach, Patty Durand, a farm transition consultant and author, and Heather Watson from Farm Management Canada. This conversation will explore how to manage the emotional dynamics of transitions and provide actionable strategies to support families in challenging times. At Agriculture Financial Services Corporation, or AFSC, we believe in empowering producers with more than just financial services. Our goal is to be a trusted partner for all of your farm planning needs, and that's whether it be offering risk mitigation strategies, financing options, or supporting your farm's transition to the next generation. Today's session is part of our commitment to helping farming families thrive, both financially and emotionally, as they move into the future. Before I hand things over to our panelists, I really want to thank you all for joining us on such an important day. It's events like these that remind us of the strength and resilience of the agriculture industry and community. And we're proud to support initiatives like this, where we can come together to ensure that the future of agriculture is in good hands. Please feel free to join the conversation on our social media using the hashtag FTA Day 2025 and follow along with the event updates. Now, please join me in welcoming our panelists to share their valuable insights into managing emotional well-being during farm transitions.
Thank you so much, Amber. That was fantastic. And just as you were telling everyone about the hashtag, I was finding it and putting it into the chat. So if anybody needs
Awesome.
to copy that hashtag, please feel free to share it out. Also, just a couple of housekeeping items. We do ask that those of you who are not speaking to make sure that you are on mute. And second, if you have a question that pops up or you would just like to appreciate the speakers, please feel free to use the chat function. Michaela and I will be watching the chat, and if you have a particular question or a comment that you'd like us to insert as part of the conversation, that we'd be happy to do so. And with that, and just a reminder that it is being recorded as well. So for those of you who were not able to make it today, of course, or make it to the live session, welcome and thank you. These will be posted on various YouTube channels, including Do More Ag, Bright Track Consulting, and AFSC, and more across Canada. So thank you so very much. And with that, I want to start with, I had a chance to talk to all of our presenters today, and I'm so excited to have everyone here on the farm transition panel. One of the things that I think about when I think about farm transition is, how do you know you're ready? And so that's actually the question that I want to start with. What are the clear signs that a farmer is actually ready to transition out of agriculture into something else, whether that's a completely different job or retirement? What can farmers do to make sure that they're ready for that transition? And I'm actually going to pick on Heather Watson to open this conversation.
It's a great question. And when I first read it, I thought, well, I can't say I've ever met a farmer who's ready to transition out of agriculture. In our work, we find that most farmers want to keep farming and involved in agriculture in some way, shape, or form. And we tend to find their biggest fear is what will happen to them after they transition the farm. So we find that for a lot of farmers, their identity is as a farmer, whether that's good or bad. That's to be discussed another day, perhaps, or maybe later today. But if they're no longer farming, then what? And a lot of fear comes with this. So they hear horror stories about Farmer Jim who retired and moved to the city and just dropped dead. So they're like, I can't leave the farm. Like, I don't want that to happen to me. So it sounds strange, but it's a reality that prevents a lot of farmers from taking steps towards transition planning. But of course, that leaves the next generation uncertain about the future of the farm and the opportunity to take over, which presents a huge challenge, as I'm sure we'll get into today. I like to kind of borrow a phrase from Dick Whitman, who's a farm consultant in the States, and he says, how do you get out of the way without going away? And so that opens up a conversation where we can see the senior generation transitioning from making the everyday decisions to kind of being a sounding board of sorts for the next generation, while the next generation gets to kind of start taking on that responsibility for making the decisions on the farm. And of course, there's various ways that you can do that. So in terms of making sure you're ready for transition, or if you're ready, there's kind of a tremendous psychological component to the readiness, I think, for both generations, and as well as the technical aspects. And that's why I'm really happy today we're focusing on more of the emotional side and the kind of mental health side of things. Because we have to make sure, of course, that the farm is viable for transition from a financials perspective, etc., but also the readiness of the current and next generation. And I think this really starts with open and effective communication. I know my colleagues will comment on that quite a bit, probably during this conversation, but to really open up to understand any resistance to transition and how it can be overcome. And it's going to take dedication and leadership, and thankfully there's help available.
Thank you so much, Heather. Patty, would you like to chime in?
Thank you. Yes. Great start, Heather. I couldn't agree more. I'm going to just build on a couple of things that I think are nuances. I do feel that at times our society thinks about retirement as a very date on a calendar, very Freedom 55 old language of that sort. And what I've come to appreciate is that what is helpful is that transition is more of a continuum than a date on the calendar. And so rather than thinking about, are you ready for a transition? How are you preparing for it? How are you getting to that point and those baby steps towards that in terms of conversations, in terms of identity. So what are you going to do afterwards, or what might shift or be done differently? And when I think about the question, what are clear signs someone is ready? And when should you start planning? I love the Stephen Covey approach of begin with the end in mind. The best day to start thinking about your exit is the day you start farming. And if you haven't started yet, today's the next best day.
What an excellent thought. Lydia, please chime in.
Yeah, it's such a, anyway, it's a great question. And I love questions and open-ended questions. Like, how do you know you're ready? Um, and I think that it's just so contextual for everybody, and there's so many different factors at play. Culturally, I think we tend to think in black and white and like very dichotomous. So this concept of like, I'm sick, I'm well, I'm in, I'm out, I'm farming, I'm not. And I think it's, and I think everyone on the panel, you probably would appreciate this, but like I think why we use the term transition is because we're always in states of transition. And so I always think of like what is the first and then the next step. And so Heather talked about this concept of readiness, and like sometimes it is the emotional piece of being ready. And like what if you're not well enough? Or and also sometimes elements of transition are kind of forced upon us. Like we are physically just not able or just not to complete the tasks of the day. And so part of the question I think you asked Merle is like, how do you make sure you're ready? And I'm just for context, I'm in southwestern Manitoba. I'm in a non-family transition, and I started my farming career in my 20s. And it was about 5 years in that we started to like engage in a transition with another farmer and other farmers in their businesses where they were letting go of things that we were able to then grab onto, which is part of transition. And they're still very much well in the business of agriculture, but they could see that in order for us to get in, they had to reposition and move. And in my mind, that is a huge element of transition. And sometimes it's a reinvention in agriculture. Like you're going, I spoke with farmers who they were transitioning out of something to go into something else within agriculture, like on the value add side or a new joint venture. And so that might look different for someone who wants to stay in. And then I would say like, yeah, practically, like sometimes there's just like physical and emotional reasons that we need to exit. Sometimes there's family dynamic reasons that we have to start to prepare ourselves. It's a very nuanced, it's kind of a clear question, Merle, but the answer is so nuanced and so specific to the individuals.
I really appreciate you phrasing that way, because and all of you touched on this, is that it is absolutely context specific. People's reasons might be different. You all mentioned, there might be health, there might be what they're transitioning into, and that might be different, and that would make some differences. And so really context dependent. It does lead us right to the next question. And Lydia, I'm going to keep you on for this one. When should a farmer start thinking about a farm transition? And Heather, and Patty, you talked about this, like right when you first start farming, and this next best is today. But is there sort of a time period? How do you, and then after they start thinking about this, when the idea comes to them, how do you suggest they go about opening the discussion with family and with farm staff? What does that look like? And Lydia, we'll start with you.
Okay, well, okay. I'm just writing a little note here. I feel like the right thing to say or the correct answer, if there is one, is like, oh, just have the conversation early and often, no problem, and start talking to your kids about it when they're young. But I think there's two different, in my mind, I'm kind of thinking this in like two different ways. One is like from a business management side, you have off ramps as a risk management strategy. You have an idea of how you could exit this thing if you had to, or if you wanted to, because that is part of it. Like you basically build in choice. And so if you build in choice and you build in these off ramps, you feel like you've got options. And like as a I would say a younger producer in my mid-career, I like having options. I like to know that I could exit if I needed to. And so that's my own personal transition. It's my own exit strategy. Do I have a successor? Not yet. No. Right. And so there's a couple of things. One is personally, can you create if you've created an on-ramp, or if you're going to do, a joint venture or start a new enterprise, or you're in a farm, do you have off-ramps? Do you and your spouse talk about those things? Because often it's like this feeling of feeling trapped, like we've built ourselves like a really nice prison here. How do we get out? And so keeping your options open, that's a form of transition. And I would say, yeah, again, like start if you haven't had that conversation yet, do it now. If you're 20 or 30 or 40 or 70, like if you haven't had it. The other one is like, do you have a successor? Because different people will approach this conversation differently. Am I creating an estate plan because I have non-farming benefactors and no one is going to take this farm over? Am I going to work with do I have a land renter who is actually an active farmer and they could take on a lot of my resource base and assets, and we're going to have a tactical transition where we don't have tons of emotion. And I feel like I'm answering this in like three different ways, but like I would say early and often, and if you haven't had it yet, starting to have those conversations. There's emotional factors, there can be conflict, there can be like health issues, like if you're not feeling well enough to have that, kind of preparing yourself for that, and just knowing that you have options. And then exploring like what those are. And if you do have a successor, starting to have those conversations and yeah, and finding support if you need it. So I don't know if that answered the question,
No,
but
that's really, really good. And I'm going to ask Patty to jump in because already we're seeing things coming in on the chat, and basically it's taking what you just said to the next step. And that is, if your family is not involved in agriculture, if you live and breathe farm and you're very connected to the farm and your family's not involved, how do you engage that transition? How do you talk with your family or your farm staff around that transition? Patty, I know you've seen a lot in your work. Maybe you could jump in here.
Absolutely. And Lydia, amen. I totally agree. And one thing I will build on is one thing I've recognized. So in the hundreds of families I've spoken with, the conversations that they need to have, often they will be advised, have this conversation. You should ask this question, do this. But what became clear is that they don't have the language. They've never done this before. It's deeply emotional. It triggers old stuff. And when it's they're kind of in a hijack state or a little bit anxious, they misspeak. They don't quite say what they want to say. And so I've spent quite a bit of time developing scripting. Not that they have to say this word exactly, but take this and build your own language around it. How might you ask this question? How might you open this door? How can you do it in such a way? So, for example, I have a one that is to speak to your heirs. So, what the question in the chat is talking about, saying, okay, how might I go about this? How might I say this and open the conversation, expressing my angst or concern or things that I don't know the answer to, and open that conversation. And so that's actually a good chunk of. So when I was introduced that I'm an author, in the book, The Future Leader, I have several scripts to build on because it is okay. You can be intelligent, experienced, and caring and not know how to do this. All of those things can be true, and it's okay.
That is a brilliant answer. And thank you very much for bringing up your book, because that's something that I wanted to weave in throughout the day. But one of our lucky attendees today is going to win a copy of Patty's new book, The Future Leader, which is all about farm transition. And so if you don't happen to be the lucky winner today, you can go online and you can purchase her book. And we will put the link towards the end of this conversation. And I know that you wrote that book drawing on your experience. Exactly. You've worked with hundreds of families, and Lydia, you as well, in terms of helping them through that getting those conversations started and then walking through them. What is the one thing, Heather, that you would like to add to this particular conversation about starting that conversation about farm transition, how to go about it, when to go about it?
I'm so glad you asked because I was so afraid we were going to move on to the next question. I'm like, oh, I want to interrupt. But Lydia, I love the analogy of the off ramps. I think that's so smart. And thinking about like our capacity to engage in those off ramps, right? Like oftentimes we think of ourselves and it's our business and it's our blood, sweat, and tears, but looking at the expectations we're putting on our spouse in terms of what's going to happen next in the next generation, looking at everyone's kind of age and stage as well. I think those are important considerations because I mean, I got into my career late 20s, say early 30s, but so thinking of kind of that, like the next generation, I mean, it's kind of all over the place in terms of the transition planning and when families have the conversations and take over. But if your kids are at the point where they normally would be starting their careers and maybe they're probably, meeting a potential spouse or starting a family, and then they're taking on the farm as well. So I think it's really important to hold kind of space to have that grace and empathy for what everyone's going through. And especially when we're thinking of the retiring generation, so the senior generation, the parents, like it can be a really scary thing to not wake up and do what you've always done the way you've always done it. And Patty, I really like your comment about, just not having the words to have the conversation. I think that's so important. We see that in the work that we do as well, where we'll hold these workshops and the farmers are literally writing down word for word the words that we're saying because they don't have the language. Like we know most farmers didn't get into farming to be business managers, let alone manage people and conflict and interpersonal and family dynamics, right? And so I think it's really important to think about where we are in this and kind of, have that understanding. I wanted to just quickly pick up on, if I can, Lydia talking about the off ramps and kind of identifying successors, because, kind of some farms are going to transition to the next generation within the family, and some are going to, yeah, we hear a lot of farmers that and there was a comment in the chat here, my kids aren't interested. We hear that more and more often. And I just want to say, like, regardless of what the situation is in terms of the future of the farm, we talk about the importance, again, from a psychological aspect of looking at who the successor could be or should be. And this goes back to your question, when should you start having the conversation? So a friend of mine, Matt Lobley, he works for the University of Exeter in the UK, and he studied with his colleagues something called the succession effect. And so they found that as farmers age, and this goes for other family businesses as well, but specifically for farmers, they naturally start to invest less in the business, take less risks, like kind of naturally step away, feeling tired, maybe feeling those aches and pains from years of just, nose to the grindstone. And so this can make it really difficult for the next generation once the parents decide, hey, I think I'm ready to think about transition, but we haven't invested in the latest technology or equipment or machinery, or our buildings are falling down. And so the other side of this, which is the good side, I'll turn to the good side now. There's a natural tendency that is reversed when farmers have identified a successor or at least thought about the future of the farm. So that's why thinking about it as early as you can is important, because you'll continue to invest in the business to ensure you have something viable to pass on to the next generation. So thinking about transition early means you're taking into consideration how your decisions today, so, building that barn or building that coverall or buying that land, is going to affect the next generation. And I think that's really important way to start thinking about the transition, like right from the get-go, as my colleagues have said.
I think that's really really brilliant, and my brain went flash because I was thinking about some books that I've read, and these are just novels. One was set in Saskatchewan, and it was about a farm transition where the person who had the farm was struggling with the farm transition, not because they didn't have someone who was ready to take it over. They did, but they knew that they were going to change the farm. And so the kind of farming that was going to happen on that landscape was going to be very different. And they were struggling with that. So that might be something that, perhaps Patty, if you can pop in, that wasn't a question that was on your pre-made list, but is that something that you've seen?
Yeah, and it's true. What keeps popping to mind right now is, and this goes back to the first question, just talking about like, how is someone ready? It is very normal that you will hear the current leader say, I want this to happen. I want this to be yours. I want to transfer it, and then have behavior that completely contradicts it. Both of those things can be true. You will, and it's not that they don't have good intentions or don't have the thought process and the commitment, but they're fighting against their own challenges and their desires of the farm to stay consistent, or their beliefs or their assumptions. And so when Lydia explained, start early and often, that's part of the conversation. It's like, wow, when you do that, it really upsets me because for this reason. And so we need to talk about this. Or I really want this to happen. Please know I'm having a hard time. One of the critical ingredients in successful transition are buckets of grace that you give to each other, because it's hard and yet it's worth it. And so just knowing that, and knowing that, man, I feel like you're saying this, but doing this, help me understand, is a really good practice for each other.
I think that that's a wonderful addition. Buckets of grace. I think maybe that's what we'll call this panel next year when we run it. We're going to call it buckets of grace. That's the new phrase. I'm going to stay with you, Patty, because I think that what you just said transitions really well into this. But what's typically, when we think through that trying to maintain that sense of harmony, trying to keep everybody harmonious and on the same page and sort of on the path together, because that's such a difficult part, and that's our focus of today. What's typically the easiest part of doing that as part of the farm transition? And what's typically the biggest surprise every time that you've watched a farm go through a farm transition?
Great question. I would say the easiest is when the team, when the family, when the stakeholders that are involved are committed and recognize they're on the same team. That can be such an important source of harmony, because I think that some people misinterpret harmony as lack of conflict, and I don't think that's actually true. I would offer that the opportunity is that conflict will happen. Thank goodness we don't always agree. How can we find that fruitful? How can we encourage it? How can we be curious about it and say, wow, you think differently than I do. What does that mean? Give me more context. Say more. So if we can dig into those little pieces of friction and recognize that that is the value and the fruitfulness that can come from a team, that's where some magic can happen. The other piece of it is that, man, what just happened feels like it was intentional or hurtful, but I know you're on my team. And so therefore, we're going to keep going. The hardest part can be if conversations are not happening and they assume they're thinking the same thing. I feel like that is a vulnerability. Like, and I'll say that, like, I'll ask, like, when say a senior partner, I was like, okay, mom, dad, what are your, this is what they say. They'll say, this is what my children want. I'm like, really? How do you know that? Oh, I just know. Have you talked about it? Well, no. I'm like, I feel like mind reading is not one of your skills. It's none of our skills. So going back and doing some affirmation, which I think in the chat, those questionnaires, when you're surprised by the answers, that is what you need to go after. Avoid those assumptions, keep asking questions, and know that you're going to have different feelings, but dig into that to find the common path.
That's a wonderful observation, that we do often have assumptions. We because we work together, if we're transitioning from one generation to another, perhaps we work together on a regular basis. Perhaps you think and it's your family, you should know them. Perhaps you think you know what their thoughts are, but until you actually ask, that is absolutely an area where what you're assuming and what they're thinking could be very different. Lydia, what do you see around this? What's typically the easiest part of keeping that sense of harmony, and what's the hardest part of keeping that sense of harmony when it comes to farm transitions?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. Again, it's kind of it's a sample of that dichotomy that, like, it's easy and hard. And I don't know, like, if that sits with me. I don't know if I can. Okay, let me think here. I'm just gonna flow with a couple thoughts based on what I've just heard, and then I'll try to answer that question. And hopefully this isn't tangential from your question, but I was just thinking that like Patty said something about it's worth it, but like sometimes it's not worth it. Right? Like sometimes you're in a relationship and it's not worth it. You're in a business partnership, it's not worth it. You're managing a farm, it's not worth it anymore, or not the way that it was. And it reminds me of this concept of like the sunk cost fallacy. And we do this, like we invest our time a lot like we invest our money. Like it's very emotional. The choices that we make about investing money or investing time are like quite emotional and sometimes not very rational. And so the sunk cost fallacy is the idea that like you're reluctant to abandon a strategy because you've invested so much in it. So you're not gonna leave the family farm, like goodness forbid, because that's your family, it's your legacy, it's where you've put everything in, even if the business strategy isn't sound and the relationships are not great. And there's various reasons why relationships may not be great. And that takes more exploration, right? That might be therapy and counseling. That might be like internal system stuff. It might have to do with self-worth and self-esteem. Maybe you haven't ventured to explore your self-esteem outside your family farm and you actually don't know how amazing you are or where you could improve because you don't have those systems in place. And so when you talk about like what's the most difficult, sometimes it's like a lack of exposure to ourselves, like really being able to like know who we are and know how we engage in communication and conflict and also know how we value our money and our time. Like that can be sometimes I think maybe the most challenging aspect of it, maybe. And sometimes there's external forces that we simply can't control, but I don't, and I think, Merle, we've talked about this. It's not like I don't talk to many farmers and they're like, I'm so stressed and I just can't cope because I'm so worried about the next drought. They might be like, no, we're in a drought and I'm really stressed, but like, that's not why I'm not sleeping. I'm not sleeping because my kids don't talk to me. Right? So sometimes it's not worth it, but sometimes it's not, like the next step is not to completely abandon the strategy. It's to like self-reflect and understand what we're doing and why it's not paying off in the way that we want it to.
I
Anyway,
think you,
yeah.
yeah, I think you raise a really, really critical point because that is going back to Patty's comment about assumptions is that sometimes we assume that the next generation wants to take over. Sometimes we assume that the person who's farming and the load of guilt that they have is like, well, of course I have to take over this farm. It's a fifth generation family farm. We've been here since, 1882 and, southwestern Saskatchewan or whatever. And this sense that they must continue without having the time to figure out who they are themselves and if they want to actually continue on this path. I'm so glad that you raised it, Lydia, because it's not something that oftentimes gets talked about enough to create space for those hard and deep conversations. Heather, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just have a couple little things here to say. When I think of the easiest part, I always think of the self. And so, I mean, easy is always in quotations. I don't all have an easy button. But I think when it comes to transition, what I would perhaps recommend is try to learn more about yourself. So whether you're the junior generation or the potential generation or just part of the family, not just, of course, amazingly part of the family, or senior generation, like take some time. Like I can't stress the importance enough of writing everything down for you. So like, what are your hopes? What are your dreams? What are your fears? What are your assumptions? Even if it might sound silly or ridiculous, it's like you need to start with this self-awareness to kind of check yourself. Like, have I even thought of these questions for myself before I ask them what they want? And so having that clarity, and I think it's a lot perhaps harder than we think to understand what we really want and what we're okay with. Where will we live? If not on, the home quarter, what's acceptable? How far away do we want to be? And then, wouldn't it be great if everyone could take part in this exercise? And of course, here comes maybe some challenges because not everyone wants to kind of go down that road. But if we don't know what we want for ourselves, it's going to be really hard to communicate that to others. And so I would definitely stress that. And then just picking up on what my colleagues were saying in terms of, not everyone wants to or is prepared to take over the farm, et cetera, or it might look differently. One of the biggest surprises we've come across, and I think it's a good one, is that sometimes transition isn't the answer. Sometimes it's it sounds weird, but it's best that it doesn't work, and that's okay. We've heard the phrase culture eats strategy for breakfast. You can have the best strategy in the world, but if you find yourself, and I'm thinking of a really good friend of mine, if you find yourself in a toxic culture, where there is no resolution and you've tried and you're suffering and your family is suffering, I just want producers to know if they're listening, you are not alone. Like there are farms going through everything when it comes to transition, all ways, shapes, and forms. And we see this. We see our farmers come together in our workshops, and sometimes they walk away saying, holy cow, I need to go hug and kiss my mom and dad and really appreciate what they're trying to build for us. And in other times, you say, wow, it doesn't have to be that hard. What do you mean? Maybe we need to think about that and what we want for our young and growing family down the road. So I know it's maybe not the nicest topic to talk about, but sometimes farm transition isn't the right solution for everybody.
I
I'm
want to
glad
just
that
make one
we've
quick
had this. Yeah,
comment.
please. I was just
Sorry,
going to
you
ask
know
you to
what?
jump in.
Lydia, you nailed it because, and I think it's important to clarify. So worth it doesn't necessarily refer to the business. It's about seeking clarity and understanding. Sometimes the baby's ugly. Sometimes the situation or the farm. I know I use that terminology, but it's true. Like everybody's passing around this baby as though everything's fine. I'm like, this is an ugly baby. And so I want to give space for that, but also that it's worth it to have the conversation. It's worth it to clarify assumptions. It's worth it to get to a level playing field. And yeah, so I thank you for that.
And I think I'd echo what Patty and Lydia talked about as well in terms of, um, you know, we're often surprised that our fears and our assumptions are actually unfounded, but we need to have the conversations to get there. Like we hear, you go to these farm events and you get pulled aside, and I've got an older senior farmer saying, well, the next generation's just going to sell the farm and make away with the money. But in reality, the next generation is just as passionate about farming and the farm too. And their biggest fear is actually being the generation that lost the farm. And that's why they're scared of the conversation, because they want to make sure they have what it takes. Because, you know, nobody's a better farmer than mom and dad, right? And you have to, you feel you have to live up to that potential. But you also might need to do things differently because it's a different business environment or landscape than how they brought the farm up. So, yeah, again, just the clarity. I can't emphasize that enough.
Just have one comment if that's okay, because you both touched on something, and so self-esteem of the individuals involved. That is it Lynn Sykes who says that she does farm transition stuff in Australia? But one of the things I think is critical is like whether or not you have or whether or not you do or do not have a view like a view of long-term optimism. So like that thing like, oh, they're gonna lose the land. That's fear-driven decision making, and it is not a long-term it's not an optimistic view long term. So an optimistic view long term would be like, we're going to get into the cattle business. We're going to have ups and downs. We'll be in it long enough that, we're going to be able to go with the ebbs and flows. We're going to manage our risk and make sure we're not overly exposed. We might diversify our portfolio. We're going to work really well together. And if we're not working well together, we're going to do, conflict management or human resources training. Like we have a view of business and long-term optimism towards that business. And in the meantime, we manage for short-term risk. So long-term optimism, manage for short-term risk. So make sure your will's up to date. Get some life insurance. Like, we all know that bad things happen, but if you have an outlook that's overly, like not overly optimistic, if you have an outlook that is overall optimistic, that's the people who stay in agriculture, right? Because and it can be relationships, it can be land, like that's why it's not, I mean, drought does keep me up at night. I don't know what you folks, but like I just on a mental health thing, we were in a drought a few years ago, and I used to use the app that was like just rain falling on windows to fall asleep. So hot tip for y'all. Uh, But it's not necessarily that specific thing because we can manage for that. We can prepare for that. It's the like, oh, if I do this, that's that catastrophic thinking. Like if I do this, this isn't going to work out. If I do that, this won't work out. But if we say, look, we have a long-term view that this business is profitable, it will work out. If it doesn't, we have options, and we're going to continue to work on the long-term view, but we're going to manage for our short-term risk. And I would say that's why my transition is working, because when we engaged with we run two independent businesses, but we're transitioning assets. The person that we're working with started this in his 40s. So he had a long-term view for the vision of his farm and a long-term optimistic view about young farmers. So he engaged us when we were in our 20s. If he had just thought we were just like whatever millennials, that might not all worked out for us. So, but anyway, I just want to say like that long-term, that visioning, and even if you don't have a successor, if you have a long-term optimistic view, then you will be open to options.
I got to build on this. Awesome, Lydia. So what you just described, I believe, is underestimated as a critical first ingredient in farm transition. It must begin with hope. And what that hope refers to when I think about it is nobody cares about your farm like you do. I care a lot. I don't care about it like you do. You need to believe you can do this. I know you can do this. This is something you can navigate. Again, what the outcome is may not be predictable, but you have to be optimistic. You can initiate and guide this process and get help to do it and ask for help, but you are driving this bus. And in the absence of hope, it's kind of paralyzing. Things don't happen. Things don't initiate. You don't take the steps towards it. You hesitate. You have risk, fears, anxiety, all of those things. And so, as fluffy as that might sound, it's the first thing I say to pretty much every client. You have to believe you can do this. I believe you can do this.
I might just be quiet and just let you guys just continue and not, try and guide this anymore because you guys are playing off each other just amazingly. The other thing that I'm seeing is that I don't know if you've all noticed, but in the chat, people are talking to each other and they're giving advice to one another, and it's fantastic. And that's exactly the conversation that we want to have, because this is all about that legacy in motion. We all have experience in this area. We've all seen different things, and each of us have something that we can offer to one another. So please continue sharing in the chat. Please continue asking your stories and or giving each other advice. I would like to go back to my panel. Share with me the story of a farm transition that went well. Of course, being anonymous, but some of the highlighted key things around a farm transition that went well, or alternatively, a farm transition that did not go well, and things that you wish perhaps that they would have done or thought about. And Patty, can I start with you?
So I will say, first of all, one of my beliefs in our industry is that a lot of, and without, this is very general, but a lot of advising and services around transition and succession have been sold on fear, uncertainty, and doubt. You will lose your farm. You will lose your family. You will pay a lot of taxes. As proposed as and the war stories, this happened, and everybody knows a story of that nature. And somehow to motivate, here, this is really difficult. You need our help. You can't do this without us. So I choose not to tell negative stories. First of all, people know them. I would say they're also awful motivators. All they do is plant seeds of doubt and prevent people from actually taking action. So in general, the most successful transitions and successions that I've had an opportunity to witness, were able to have conversations, and sought help to have them when they weren't able to have them, and didn't give up, even when it didn't go according to their plan. But I can think of one particular instance where I'm sitting at the table and there's the two successor sons who had gone away and worked for several years, come back. They brought a wealth of skills and knowledge and expertise, and we're attempting to do some planning, and we're getting just resistance from their very well-adjusted parents. But what became clear is that the hesitation that had been holding back and creating friction and kind of blow ups was ultimately the dad in particular had only held the reins for a couple of years after a split from his brothers, after he'd waited decades to have his turn. And it was in that conversation that I was able to unpack and get to that with them. And I don't know how they would have gotten there without kind of a third party to help them ease. They just kept running up against it. And so incredibly capable, incredibly intelligent, tons of farm to work with, robust business, but there were some things internally that they just needed a little bit of help. And it greased the wheels. And I spoke to the dad months later, and he just said, like, that conversation changed our farm. And so it's not about me. There's lots of individuals that do this type of work, but recognizing when you need help, I think is important. You don't need help for the whole thing, I don't believe. There's lots you can do on your own. But that's an example that comes to mind.
That's a brilliant example. And I love that we're going to stick with examples from farm transition stories and things that went well. And with that, Lydia, I'm going to pass that one to you.
I could just stay, I can't even read my notes now because I wrote words over words, but it doesn't even matter. Anyway, I just like got me thinking about themes. Okay. So and Art, you commented on one that I was really key, which is the financial transparency piece, and I'm going to go to that. So where like this concept of like where does it work, where does it not work? I don't think I've been alive, well, not alive. I don't think I've been doing this work long enough to see anyone through their transition, but what I see are patterns and themes. And I say that because transitions take years. And so if a transition takes 10 or 20 years, I'm 39, folks. So like I didn't start this when I started farming in my 20s. But I would say, okay, themes. So things that make it challenging, secrecy, which I think is a lack of trust, and that can come out as a lack of financial transparency. Sometimes it's a lack of financial literacy, which leads to a lack of financial transparency. So judgment is also a problem when you're judging people, like they don't want to share with me, but actually they just don't know how. That's a readiness and a willingness thing that Heather mentioned. One is unaddressed health issues. So this could be physical health issues or mental health or addictions issues, which then leads to like other issues around trust. Isolation, which can also exacerbate mental health addictions issues, and not having peer support, where perhaps you're in a community, if like this is where judgment comes into play. So if you have a history of being in a community or around people where there's lots of judgment and comparison, that can be a bit of a red flag and make things really difficult. And then you don't necessarily know who to open up to. Intergenerational trauma is another one because we have lots of people who've come to this country as after the Russian Revolution, for example. So I'm in Manitoba, there's lots of Mennonite communities. And so sometimes that lack of communication can have cultural elements, but it can have intergenerational trauma issue elements. I once facilitated for people who were descendants of like POWs on both sides of their family, and they never talked about anything. And like, again, no judgment, right? But that is a reality. Look, you think about the timelines of the history of us being on this continent. Some of the things that are super helpful, Art, I'll go back to you, financial transparency, but also the financial literacy piece. So if you don't know, ask. And if your accountant or your bookkeeper is just talking over your head, be like, look, you got to stop and explain this to me. And these are my questions. And if you don't know what questions to ask, that's where facilitation can help, or getting someone to help ask those questions. Being open-minded about a lot of things, communication, conflict, but also paying tax, being open-minded about paying tax. And so I find like really dogmatic approaches to certain things can be a bit of a problem as far as like trying to keep your options open. And so that might be one. And then also thinking about the money scripts or the psychology of money in your family and why it is that you do things the way that you do them. And actually, there's a book called The Psychology of Money. It's very good. And I didn't read it. I listened to it. And I always feel weird saying I listened to a book, but whatever. And then seek added support is another thing. And then is it a business? Is it profitable? Does it cash flow? And that's financial transparency, but that's also honesty about what this thing is, and also understanding the unique economics of agriculture and how the benefits of being in agriculture can support you, and and also exploring additional options like that you can actually add value to your business, or the next generation can add value to your business. So when you see an entrepreneurial approach to transition, that's often where you might have successes as well. Because you might have a grain operation and then someone wants to add like a scaled greenhouse business, and it's like they're non-competing and they're collaborative. And then emotional IQ, particularly when you have larger groups and you have more diffuse structures. And so I think the Family Business magazine, I don't know if it was recent that I read the article, but one of the things that I was reading, or maybe it was Harvard Business Review, was the more diffuse your structure and the more family members, the better you have to be at human resources, like better than the biggest companies. You got to be like real good. And if you're not, then you can ask for some support and get some education. And so lifelong learning, um, that's another part as far as like um, good stories, like where people seem to be doing well.
That was so much. Heather, there was so many head nods. I'm sure you have more to add. There was a lot of this going on too. Did you notice that?
I mean, how do I come in after Patty and Lydia? Like that was just amazing and everything. And I'm so glad, Patty, that you started first because like absolutely there is enough fear out there and every situation is different. Like we don't understand what's going on, behind closed doors. And so I'm really glad that we're focusing on the positive side and what can you do? Because there's enough chat around, the Timmy's coffee table or whatever. And then Lydia, to your point about, and we've talked about this a little bit, but, you know, understanding and Art, I'm so glad you're here because the financial literacy and transparency is so important and understanding like what's working and like you might love, I mean, I don't want to put any quantity down, but let's say you might love beef farming or sheep farming, but in your area, in your market with trade the way it is, whatever the case may be, or the next generation doesn't like cows that much. They just don't. And so being open to can we maintain the farm? But maybe it takes a different, shape or form. Maybe we get into, like Lydia says, greenhouses or vertical farming or something else that brings joy and, passion to the next generation. Does it matter that the farm continues as a beef or a poultry or dairy or cereals operation? Can it look differently, but produce different things and still fit your vision? And Patty, I'm so glad you concentrated on the importance of starting with a vision and having hope that, it that you can do this and there's help available to you. So I think yeah, just again, it comes from kind of being open and having those conversations. And I was thinking about because I mean, full disclosure, we don't do the work that Patty and Lydia do. I hats off to you, ladies. We just, we're out there bringing the educators, like bringing the educational events, bringing the experts together, and facilitating conversations, much like Merle. So, but we do have a lot of conversations and see a lot of things happening. And this summer, I was at a conference, and twice I had senior male farmers in their late 70s pull me aside, and just for a chit chat, how's it going? Where are you from? What's going on? And then, sure enough, these conversations turn into very deep and very intimate transition conversations, which again, you can just tell is weighing on their minds. They're in their late 70s and they said, I think I'm too late to start the conversation. What do I do? And, and of course, I'm thinking, well, yeah, you've kind of let time go, but it's not a case of throw your hands up in the air and, well, I guess we'll just sell this off. There is hope. There is possibility. It just might look a little bit different. It might not be your traditional transition if there is such a thing. But just you could see the passion, but also the fear of these farmers. And the one gentleman said, well, I've got 3 kids and, this one does this one does this. So I think this one is probably best to take over. And then, so I think that's the one I'll approach. And I'm thinking, my goodness. Like maybe you could start by asking your children, if they're interested in farming, what they would want to do. And then the other one kind of said, well, I don't think my kids are gonna take over the farm. So what are my options? I'm thinking, have you asked them? Well, no, but like I'm pretty sure. Da, 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 da. And so again, it comes back to I think what we started with at the beginning of this conversation. Communication, 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 and recognizing that for sure, I mean, I don't even have the right communication skills to communicate with my family, let alone in a family enterprise that has so many benefits, but also some unique challenges as well. So, again, like there is help out there and in the chat. It's so nice to see this community come together, supporting each other. So lean on each other and lean on the experts like Patty and Lydia.
And that's exactly the point that I want to pick up on. One of the things that we had discussed prior to opening up to all of you is this idea of a farm transition team and that's something that all three of you have kind of brought, bring someone in, bring in a third party, bring in someone to listen, bring in someone else, facilitator. Where's the value in having a farm transition team and who all should be included on such a thing? Lydia, can I start with you?
I mean, I see these things as tools and resources, and I'll just give you a personal example. When I first started my farm business, this might seem silly to folks, but when I first started my farm business in my 20s, I just thought I had to keep my own books for some reason. And so I was trying to do that, and I found it really stressful when I was also trying to build a business. Like I didn't have a lot of support around me because I didn't have family at that time, and I didn't have these preconceived ideas of what I ought to do, but I kind of did, right? So like I'm trying to do this, and a friend of mine, like I remember like sitting, I don't know if I was crying, but I was like sitting somewhere and I was like feeling sorry for myself, and I told my friend, she's like, you just need a bookkeeper. Like you just need another person to help you. And it almost felt like an intervention. Like she came over and like we got my stuff and we went to another friend who's a bookkeeper. And she's like, yeah, no problem. I can do this for you. And it turns out she's also an accountant. And I have been able, like, she's still my accountant and my bookkeeper. And I have been able to learn so much from her, like, glean so much knowledge. So I'm paying her to do my books and my accounting, but I get to ask her all kinds of questions. And I'm a naturally curious person. And so I have learned a ton. And I could keep my own books now, but I'm busy with other stuff. But like, I've learned so much from her. And certainly there are people that may be of more value to you than others. And I don't mean intrinsically, I just mean like their time and service. And so like finding like what are the things that you need help with and support with. So some of them might be the soft skills like human resources, facilitation, even conflict management. And that's kind of what I do and I think what Patty does. And like Heather said, conflict's not bad. It's just actually, and or Patty, you said that conflict's not bad. It's kind of like the natural, like if you're working with people, you are going to have some disagreement and you're going to have to work through some stuff. And so I think of like the soft side of things. Most farms don't have a human resources department, but a lot of companies do, and there's a reason for that. And like, yeah, bookkeepers and accountants ask the questions you need to ask. And obviously having lawyers and accountants that can support you with the tactical part. And I think a lot of it, and I speak from experience as a farmer, like then not only are you not alone, but then you're not alone. And I know a lot of folks who work in these industries with a very high degree of integrity and value for wanting to be of service. So find those folks. And just like so that you don't have to do this all by yourself and knowing that you have tools in your toolkit that you can pull on. You don't have to use them every day or all the time, but you know that they're there. And you know that that's what they're there for, that the professionals train in these areas and there's no judgment. It's approaching it from curiosity and wanting to learn more and working together. So I mean, I see value in it for our business, for our farm. And it's part of the reason I do this is because, um, yeah, I just want people to be well.
I think that's brilliant. Patty, can I get you to jump in?
So I will offer that the most critical members of a farm transition team are the farm family members. They have to be creating the directive of what they want their advisors to accomplish. So them being able to clearly describe their desired future state and continue to work through that and evolve it and know that it's kind of in pencil because everything's changing. But that you being able to clearly as a family say, and be involved in those conversations. That's number one. Number two, something that I encounter frequently. People assume that their accountant and lawyer that they've been working with for the last 20 years is going to be equipped to help them guide through the very strategic and specialty of transition. There are very significant nuances. There's 40 pages of ag tax law alone. And if you do not have a specialist, that could be challenging. So I will say, if you assume that your regular accountant can help you with family transition, you may be assuming the same thing as your family doctor helping you with a brain tumor. You would assume you would go to a specialist. It doesn't, I'm not saying they're not qualified, but I'm saying ask your advisors, are you qualified to help us? And are you prepared? Do you have the expertise to help us through the next 5 to 10 years? This is what we're trying to accomplish. Can you do that for us? And if you can't, who might you refer us to? So I've certainly sat with families who are like, yeah, our accountant really isn't bringing this up and we're not having these strategic conversations. That may not be their specialty. They may be an excellent annual financial statement accountant, not qualified or prepared to guide you in that process. And that's okay, but you got to ask.
I think that that's absolutely wonderful and excellent advice, because bringing in the best people that you can will help and worth every penny. And one of the things that I've been noticing in the chats going on, and this was a little bit earlier on, but the people who we brought together today are some of the experts in this. So please reach out to them. So Patty Durand of Bright Track Consulting, Lydia Carpenter, Farm Family Coach. They both have incredible experience. If you're looking for some resources just to read, just so that you're more prepared, then Farm Management Canada has done an extensive amount of work in this area, and there are resources there. Another point that just got brought up in the chat, and I want to pick up on it, is that these things are difficult. Finding harmony for others is part of it, or finding harmony for all of you is part of it, but you also need to look after yourself first. And there may be things that get raised during this process that are difficult for you. And if that does happen to you, all across Canada, there are a number of resources that have been developed that are specific for farm and ag. So in Manitoba, the Farmer Wellness Initiative. In Saskatchewan, Sask Ag Matters. In Alberta, Ag No. In BC, please go to Ag Safe BC. They have a whole area now, I think it's called Ag Farm, that is all about helping people in, of course, in Saskatchewan, in Ontario Wellness Initiative. I have a list in my head. And so, apologies for all those of you who might be out east, but please go and find, or please come to the Do More Agriculture website. We have links to all of these as well, because we want to connect you in with help. Maybe you already go to a therapist. Please feel free to bring that up as well. It is very, very important that you look. Ag Life, thank you very much. And if you're going to any of the ag shows, there's going to be speakers at a lot of these ag shows. Reach out to them and ask, because there are helps available. And one of you brought it up, and Lydia, I think it might have been you, that sometimes there are unresolved mental health issues that are going on behind the scenes, and you can't force someone else to address their mental health issues. All you can do is look after yourself and your own. However, you can maybe encourage them, or you can maybe bring in a therapist who has some expertise in this area as part of your farm transition, and just creating space to open these conversations. And with that, I am going to ask Amber to bring a few final words from AFSC to close off our session, and to thank all of our listeners. And there's a lot of thank yous that are going on in the chat, and we are going to copy and paste the chat and keep those as well. And so if you asked any particular question, we are going to reach back out to you and connect you with those resources. That's part of what we do here at Do More Ag, and across all of these. And with that, Amber, if you could close us out.
Phenomenal session today. I just want to thank everybody for joining. Between Merle, Patty, Lydia, and Heather, some great information given to you all. This isn't an easy journey. It's step by step. So wish everybody the best of luck on their journeys. Please engage those qualified members into your team as you're moving from stage to stage. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. And with that, we will close it out. Wishing you all the best in 2025, wishing you all the best in your farm transition. Reach out if you need some more support. Oh, one last thing. One of you who was here today, lucky winner, is going to receive a free copy of Patty's new book. We are going to put all of the names of everyone who was here into a draw, and we will send you an email using the email that you used to sign up on Eventbrite and let you know so that we can get your mailing address and get it out to you. Thank you all so very, very much. You're very lucky. I'm looking forward to my own copy. Thanks, everyone.